This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, the first week of October 2008, which is another big recent election moment in the wake of the spiraling economy, the housing collapse, and the proposed massive bailout of banks that were over-leveraged on credit default swaps and so forth. There's also a huge election. Remember that? Huge election entering its final month. It is Barack Obama versus John McCain. And the banking crisis provides a really fascinating test case of leadership in crisis for these two candidates, which I would argue is perhaps the most important thing you're trying to gauge when you're selecting a leader. How do they respond to an unforeseen crisis? And how does John McCain respond? Well, he suspends his campaign. We'll get to why he did that for reasons that I'm sure at the time felt very valid. But we'll cut to the chase and say that it was not really an effective move, both when it came to addressing the crisis itself and when it came to making the case that he should be president, the politics of it all. So let's all go back to the fall of 2008, the most stressful and crazy moment in modern political history until, basically the last 10 years or so. But here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Longing for those days when the wheels were coming off the economy.
Yeah, exactly.
Such happier times.
Hi, Jody.
Hey there.
I remember 2008, that was like basically the first thing I ever covered in my journalism career. And I remember thinking like, oh, well, maybe I just covered the craziest thing I'll ever cover. And then I definitely had that feeling in 2016. And I actually think in 2016, that might have been right. I walk around with the idea that like, I've probably seen the most stressful thing I'll ever see.
Not
and that's kind of nice.
Not 2021.
Well, the fall, yeah, I know. The spring of 2020
all fallout from 2016.
But yes. And of course, listeners, we're just coming off of our two-part special on October Surprises. We name-checked this, talked about it a little bit, said we were going to dive a little deeper into it. So here we are diving deep as we kind of really gear up with some election coverage, both about past elections and our ongoing Sunday specials to talk about this year's election. So, often we take turns on who's going to take the lead on stuff here. So either of you wanted to explain credit default swaps and how they
I was going to start with mortgage-backed securities.
And how the TARP was intended to address the securitization that it over-leveraged.
You have to understand credit tranches, Jody.
Let's start with money. What is money?
Listen, this is why I'm a historian, people. I don't do math. I don't do numbers. I don't do quadratic differentials. I don't know. I don't do any of it. It's wild. This is going to be wild.
So banks made a bunch of risky decisions. A lot of people borrowed a lot of money that they didn't really have. The house of cards started to come down in the fall of 2008. A bunch of banks are collapsing. And there is this specific salient question in front of the Senate, which is a bailout bill, right? What are we going to do to bail out these banks? That was a big sort of philosophical question of, do banks deserve bailouts? But clearly something needs to happen. And it's that political process of the bill that seems to be the animating thing for McCain in making this decision to suspend his campaign, right?
Well, it's a really tricky bill. And there is a populist question at the heart of this. There are all of these toxic assets that are now spread throughout the economy. And the question is, does the government use taxpayer money to bail out these fraudulent financial corporations, or do you let them collapse? And the problem is, if you let them collapse, everyone suffers even more. And so now politicians are being asked to do something very unpopular, which is to bail out these fraudulent financial institutions. And McCain is looking at this and he says, all right, well, the country is in crisis. And the slogan for my campaign is country first. So I'm going to suspend my campaign in order to fulfill that promise and focus on fixing the country. And that is about as far into the thought process as he got, because he didn't come up with any big solutions or big, great political maneuvers. He suspended his campaign went to Washington, D.C. and sort of ran out of steam at that point, in my opinion.
Yeah. It also felt like stalling a little bit. Like I'm not quite sure where my own campaign is going, but if I seem like I'm on, like I've got a plan, or I'm headed to do this great work, that people will somehow see me as a leader and, you know, say, oh, wow, wasn't that courageous of him? He put his country before his campaign. And, you know, it's meant to be seen as like this patriotic move. And it doesn't feel like that. Right. It feels like, what are you doing?
So I love that you put it that way, and let's embrace kind of McCain's logic for a minute here, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's on two fronts. One, what you were kind of laying out there, Kellie, I'm not going to put politics above the important work of this. You know, we're running this political campaign, and that's not as important as focusing on this country. I sort of see that logic, and it strikes me as very McCain-esque. Mm-hmm. You know, I think people very quickly kind of reacted and said, well, look, the point of politics is to run a country. And so, you know, these are more connected than you realize. But I think it probably betrays a kind of idea of what politics is when you think that it's not actually grave and serious and there to address real issues.
Right. That politics is fluff.
Yeah.
And governing is what he's actually there for. And when you call it McCain-esque, I mean, it's so McCain-esque that he had done it a couple of times before. He had, suspended officially announcing his campaign for the 2000 race because of the outbreak of the Kosovo War. He suspended the start of the Republican National Convention because of Hurricane Gustav. Which actually got him out of a kind of a pickle because George W. Bush was supposed to appear on the first day, and he was very unpopular in the summer of 2008.
Memory hold that, but I remember it. And I actually think conventions are pure fluff, and so I probably think at the time that was a good move, but in this moment, it didn't feel like.
Well, at this moment, you know, and Barack Obama would say this in response, which is like, as president, you have to chew gum and walk at the same time. Right. You have to do the people's business and, maybe you're running 3 other projects at the same time, 10 other projects, 20 other projects at the same time, and you can't suspend everything to focus on one thing because that's not the job.
Yeah. And I do think, you know, in that same moment, he was supposed to be a guest on David Letterman's show, and he cancels that appearance. And I think I would have been okay. Okay, fine. You've got bigger things to do than be on the Late Show or whatever. All right, fine. I'm going to give you that. But like suspending your campaign, like, isn't this supposed to be your campaign? Like, aren't you supposed to be showing the American people like what you can do in a crisis? It seems to me that should happen simultaneously.
It's probably worth now talking a little bit about Obama's response, because it's not like Obama just kept it moving and was like, we're just going to keep going with this campaign. I mean, he reoriented. He sort of, he rose to the moment within the confines and the structure of the campaign, which I think was the case he was making explicitly and tacitly, which is like, you conduct politics and you meet the moment. One specific thing that we learned after the fact, and maybe this came out in that Game Change book or something, but Obama actually called McCain at one point and said, hey, maybe we should do a joint statement about the crisis, which again, it's like, that's Obama making a shift, reorienting. So, like, obviously, Obama sees the gravity of it, the extraordinariness of the moment, and suggests something extraordinary. McCain either rejects that idea or says, like, let me think about it, and then 20 minutes later announces that he's suspending his campaign. So, there was a little bit of, like, probably a little bit of what's the word I'm looking for?
One-upmanship, I feel like.
One-upmanship, or exactly, or just like trying to game each other. But
no one's going to get to spike the ball in this moment.
Right, but he thought it was an ace up his sleeve or something, right?
Yeah.
I would imagine. Hey, it's Jody. If you're a longtime listener to Radiotopia, you probably know that we had a podcast that ran from 2016 to 2020 discussing every episode of the show The West Wing. Well, I am so excited to tell you that The West Wing Weekly is back. Joshua Malina, who starred in The West Wing as Will Bailey, and Rishikesh Hirway, creator and host of Song Exploder, have reunited this election season for The West Wing Weekly Political Film Fest, because watching and discussing art about politics can be a great way to get some perspective on what is happening in the world right now. something that if you listen to this show, you also probably appreciate. Each week, Josh and Rishi talk about a different political film with the same mix of analysis and humor that made The West Wing Weekly such a hit. The slate of films they're going to talk about ranges from classics to modern-day masterpieces, Dr. Strangelove, Network, Judas and the Black Messiah, and they're kicking it all off with The American President, which was a film written by Aaron Sorkin that would eventually lead to the creation of The West Wing. So get in on it, join the conversation, attend the virtual political film fest, subscribe to The West Wing Weekly wherever you get your podcasts.
We want to tell you about another podcast from PRX called Monumental. This podcast explores questions about the past, present, and future of U.S. monuments, uncovering the stories about what and who is important, as well as the stories that have been left out. Join host Ashley Seaford across the country with their team of journalists. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Well, and then what follows after this, I think, is as telling as the decision to suspend the campaign, because there are steps then that are taken because McCain and Obama are both senators. So they have votes that they have to give, but they're also now de facto leaders of their party. So they have a role to play in sort of helping to pull together support for whatever the solution is going to be. And the solution was this proposed Emergency Economic Stabilization Act that included $700 billion for these toxic assets. And they go to Washington, D.C. McCain calls a meeting with George W. Bush, who's like, why am I meeting with these yokels? And they all meet. And Bush is like, all right, McCain, this is your meeting. And McCain doesn't have anything prepared. He doesn't have anything to say about the financial crisis. And then ultimately they turn it over to Obama, who, because he's Obama, has like a 10-point plan and sort of going through and talking about all of this. But I think that the bigger thing that hurts McCain out of this is that there's a vote on the bailout and the Republicans vote it down.
Yeah.
And when the Republicans vote it down, the stock market tanks. It goes down like 8%. And everyone's like, what are you doing? Right. What are you doing? Yeah. Nobody likes this. But not doing anything is not an option. And I think that made McCain look weak as well, because his party was becoming the problem rather than becoming
ostensibly
part of the
he
solution.
suspended it to go in and whip his party into shape and lead them, and then they showed even more chaos. I want to go back to that meeting that McCain kind of interjects himself into and doesn't really have a plan at. Coming out of that, I think Obama then gives a quote where he says, like, gosh, this felt like a political stunt, that McCain rolls into this meeting. And he says, like, I don't want to. And now Obama is saying, I don't want to inject politics into this important process, which is exactly the kind of thing that McCain was trying to own. So, like, he really very quickly, like, undermines his own argument about the sort of relationship between politics and governing. When he's the one now he's the one who's seen as sort of pulling a stunt. Yeah,
he stepped on his own trap. I feel like that's what he did. Yeah. And it all of it just backfired, and at the end he didn't have anything to show for it. It wasn't like he could say, I went to Washington and here's the plan. It's like there was nothing that came out of this that was useful for him.
Yeah. And because of that, when he resumes his campaign very quietly just before the debate, because also there's a debate that's about to happen in the middle of all
He said he was going to not attend the debate. Yeah. And then 2 days later he says he will, which again just shows weakness and unsteadiness.
Waffling. Yeah. And so he reanimates his campaign. Not much had changed because it's not like he had like pulled his ads down or anything. So it's not clear what the campaign suspension was, but also he didn't have a victory or an accomplishment to say, okay, we suspended the campaign, we did this work, we got A, B, and C, now we're starting the campaign back up. But he just kind of like slinked back in. Yeah.
All of that was just not good. I mean, like,
didn't go well.
And again, I think too, when someone says, maybe we haven't defined this, but when someone says, I'm going to suspend my campaign, like, what does that mean? Does that mean you're not giving speeches, you're not giving ads, you're not collecting funds, that's what it should mean from my perspective, is you are not doing anything for those, few days or whatever. I don't know, that none of that made sense.
I mean, I think there's a technical reason people say suspend instead of ending, which is that they still get access to the money. But yeah, in practice, I mean, McCain, I guess he probably canceled a couple speeches and appearances, but other than that, ads were still running, money was still flowing. Yeah, I agree. It was a political stunt, and I think people realized it for that, which is ironic given that he was trying to go out of his way to say we're not doing these kinds of things.
Yeah,
So.
There's also, we've mentioned this enough times that I won't belabor it, but there's also a real parallel with the Palin choice.
Yeah.
This idea that he was going to pick somebody who was going to signal that he was choosing reform over party, and that message that he wanted to send is not the message that he actually sent. He sent a message of not having fully vetted someone and introducing a chaos agent into the campaign. So that disconnect between what he's hoping to project and what he actually projects is actually a running feature in this campaign.
And, you know, you look at the polling of this election, and it is mid-September that Obama really starts to overtake McCain and just kind of build from there. And I do think in some way, like the fact that the crisis comes along, which obviously neither of them could anticipate, but the reaction to the crisis reorients a lot of the election towards like the economy and leadership. And frankly, you know, a lot of the stuff that was dominating the earlier election, which was race and demographics and, you know, rumors about Obama's religion and all that stuff, you know, Obama just has an opportunity there to do what he was probably trying to do all along, which was sort of talk about substance. But, you know, the substance kind of just arrives there and is able to meet the moment. And, you know, one of my enduring images from 2008 was actually right after the election, but it reflects something that was happening in this moment we're talking about here too, where like the crisis appears and Obama just sort of rises to the moment. But right after the election, you know, Bush was as lame duck gets, because like not only was he obviously not going to be president again, but there was just this crisis going on. And that was basically his doing. And people were just like, we are done with this guy. And the first press conference Obama gave, he had like a little seal on the front of his podium that wasn't the presidential seal. They had mocked up a like, maybe you know this, Niki, and maybe I'm wrong, but it was like a president-elect seal or a presidential transition seal. And he had behind him all of the like people who were going to be in his cabinet. But it was basically a I'm the captain now kind of moment, you know? But, you know, the optics of that and the messaging of that was like incredible. And I do think that we saw a little of that in this moment here too. Americans could just see this man in that leadership position very clearly.
Yeah. Right. And optics are powerful, right? Yeah. Like people being able to see like, okay, someone's in charge. Someone has a plan. Someone is gearing up to take over is assuring, to say the least.
Yeah. And when you're a first, one of the things that you have to convince people is that they can imagine you in that role. Right. So I think that it mattered that he appeared presidential when he had an uphill battle when it came to appearing presidential.
Yeah. And still, 2-3 months before he was actually sworn in.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Let's leave it there. I'm really glad we got to it. And I guess this counts as a little bit of our capper to October Surprise Week. But I'm glad we got to do
our Planet Money episode.
Deeper dive on this one. Oh, gosh. Well, that also, you know, Planet Money, what a lifeline in that moment. And that's what was the rise of that as well. Okay. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Republican John McCain says he is suspending his campaign to try and solve the financial crisis and says he wants to postpone Friday night's first debate.
Republicans praise McCain's decision. Meantime, local Democrats criticize McCain's call to postpone the first debate.
It's a very strange, almost unusual move when we really need to hear from these two men who are going to be our president. This is the time when we need to hear from them more than anything else.
Radiotopia.